Hello yet again, conservationists. Welcome to Chapter 14, Zoos and Gardens with Mrs. Fose. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the benefits and downsides to both zoos and gardens. Zoos and gardens. Okay, the first thing we should discuss is in situ versus ex situ. So in situ means like in the situation. It's the natural habitat that the species are in. So natural parks, nature reserves, those species are in their natural habitat. That's in situ. So these are jackass penguins in South Africa that I took a picture of in their natural habitat. Ex situ, on the other hand, is outside of their situation. So they're in a place that they wouldn't be unless people put them there to conserve them. So this is pictures from Monkey World of vervet monkeys. So there you can see they've got food to eat that's provided for them. It's not a natural habitat. That baby vervet is suckling on mom. And this is the male vervet. Notice his testes are bright blue. Fun fact there, blue is a very hard color to make. It's energetically draining. There's not many species that are blue. So it's considered an honest indicator. So if he's making really nice blue pigment for his testes, he's probably got some real nice genetics. He's competing really well, so females might want to use him as their mate. In situ is great, but it can be very hard to manage. Right? So like this picture, you can't just like leave it be oftentimes. If you don't have all the parts working, your ecosystem can degrade. Let's look at the advantages now. So for in situ, it's great that the species is where it's adapted to. So this is where it should be able to be the healthiest and survive. Another huge one is that it continues to evolve in their environment. So it's any factors that are changing, that population, certain traits will be selected for, those individuals will be more successful, they'll be more likely to pass on their traits, and that population will be adapted to that changing environment. If they're in zoos and you release them back, they might not be as well adapted. Also, in general, they have more space, and you can have larger populations. In general, it's cheaper to keep the individuals in that native habitat rather than in a zoo. Problems? It's very difficult to control illegal exploitation. So there's elephant tusks. Elephants need huge areas. It's hard to keep that whole space safe. You have to have good fences. You have to have lots of people. It's much more difficult. And also, the environment might be degraded. You might have to restore it. You might have to deal with invasive species, some of which are very difficult to control and deal with. So now let's look at the ex situ, outside of the norm. So I've got an aquarium and botanical garden, both my pictures. So what's their purpose? House and breed animals, reintroductions to the wild with some of those individuals, and to educate the public, which is huge. This fun fact, estimated 600 million people will visit a zoo within the next year. 10% of the planet. That's a huge opportunity to educate. So let's look at the history of zoos. Before Jared Durrell, zoos were just this like, oh look, we went somewhere, we took advantage of the people, we brought back their species. Isn't that cool? Pay us money. Durrell changed that. He started to see that zoos had a responsibility, that they needed to help these animals that were close to extinction. And so he pioneered this inter-zoo exchange, where you can help different zoos exchange individuals for breeding and for information on how to raise them in captivity, because helping the animals helps everyone. And this is a quote from his book, The Overloaded Ark. It's really funny. I only got about halfway through it, though, because I was just sad that animals and places were being exploited, and I'd read too many books like that lately. But I recommend it. It's really interesting. There are only two ways to find out how an animal lives and what its habits are. One is to study it in the wilds, and the other is to keep it in captivity. As the greater proportion of zoologists cannot go to outlandish parts of the world to study their specimens in the field, the specimens must be brought to them. So that raises a good point. A colleague of mine was doing a study on elephants and looking at how they reacted to new enrichment opportunities, and she didn't need to go all the way to Africa to do that. She went to Nashville. And so she did her preliminary work there, where she figured out if her methods would be successful before another student will take it abroad. So she was able to do all of this problem solving for much less cost. The next person we're going to look at is David Attenborough. You've probably heard him. I know you've heard his voice. He narrates 2/3 of nature videos. So like Planet Earth, Life, David Attenborough. And he's written some great books. I listened to the audiobook The Zoo Quests, where he talks about when he was young. He was the first television naturalist. So what he would do is he would go to these areas where very few white people had been, and they would go in, they would film species in their native habitat, and then they would bring back a couple, and he would do the last part of his TV show in studio with those species. And he talked about how his perspective has changed over time, where he started out like eating sea turtle eggs and trying everything, and now it's become much more conservation oriented. He has educated millions, possibly a billion people. He is constantly trying to make people aware of how their actions affect species and make them care about species. Because to conserve something, you have to care about it. And he, along with Durrell from the last slide, founded the World Land Trust, which owns large portions of land that they're using for conservation. So one example of when ex situ conservation helped was zoos and their breeding program. So the Hawaiian goose was almost extinct in the wild. They put 12 birds into captivity, and they do really well in captivity. They had a population of 9,000 that they could release back into the wild. Now, unfortunately, their experiment failed because the rats that ate the young and eggs hadn't been eliminated. But they're still a species because of this conservation effort. So you've seen the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List, and that's where you find what rating species have. The worst being extinct, and the second extinct in the wild. So that's what the Canadian goose was. Then critically threatened, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, and least concern. Okay, so here's some species that fall into that extinct in the wild category. Bison, which we've reintroduced, Przewalski's horse, Pear's deer, we'll look at that. Black-footed ferrets, I discussed briefly in a previous chapter. Then they're back with prairie dogs in the North American prairie. California condor, doing great. There's that Hawaiian goose. So there's Paris David's deer from the last page. So here, it went a lot more successfully. 18 were taken in 1865. They had about 1,000 by 1981, and they reintroduced them successfully into the wild. So ex situ conservation should be your last step. If you can't fix the problems in your native area, having them in captivity at least means they're still here. It works really well for species that are easily bred in captivity, but some are really hard. Like red pandas can be difficult to breed. I'll talk about that more on another slide. Pandas, notoriously hard to breed. And then when they're in captivity, they don't evolve with their environment. Certain individuals that are less adapted wouldn't be selected against. They would be selected against by their natural environment. This is a really interesting idea. I've got a video linked to this. It's all about zoos, the land of the living dead, where they take semen samples of species and they freeze them so that individuals' genetic diversity isn't lost, and that if over time their in situ situation, their like natural habitat is restored, you can bring them back. So the AZA is the main overseer of zoos, and they have different standards that they're required to follow. So if you want to go to a zoo, make sure it's AZA. Just like our college has accreditation where people go through and make sure we're actually teaching so that our degrees mean something, they have certain standards for different species. They also maintain species survival plans. Let's look at, so this has genetic info. It says who should breed together, who are less closely related. This is a red panda. When I worked at a zoo in Fargo, we had some, and they only breed like once a year. It's really hard to have offspring, but there were 2 while I was there. It was really cool. So botanical gardens, they are the plant version of zoos, right? So they have different species that can be considered very rare, people want to see. So originally the role was economic, have people come in, pharmaceutical if they have medicinal purposes, and aesthetic, they're pretty, right? And you can see some of the same problems as captively breeding animals. These species aren't in their native habitats. They might be less drought resistant over time, for example, if they're given more water, right? The individuals that would die off don't. What we have that's really cool is seed banks. So Svalbard in Norway is the most famous. You should watch the TED Talk. They have these seed vaults which are underground that can withstand nuclear war, where they can store seeds. You'll want to watch the TED Talk, Why We're Storing Billions of Seeds by Jonathan Drori, to look at this more in depth. It's really great. International agencies. We've seen sites before, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So that sets up the regulations for how species can cross international borders. There are 3 different levels possible. Either total ban on exploiting them, passing them through, limited based on quotas, so you might be able to send, 100 pangolins through, or species requiring only protection in only certain areas. And they look at that every 2 years. Okay, have a great day.